I'm going to start off with some background information. I'm a 21-year-old male who grew up in a rural area on a small reservation about an hour northwest of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Growing up, I lived with my grandmother who was very in tune with the spiritual side of life and was very well respected by our community. I spent a lot of time in the woods hunting and camping as a young man and was fully aware of spirits and how some were good, some were bad. And there existed creatures out there that defied explanation. Now, at the time of this story, I was somewhere around 17, I think it was summer break, and I went down to my reservation to visit my cousins who were like siblings to me as I'd grown up with them. My older cousin had some alcohol and altogether, there were 7 of us who gathered on this one beautiful summer night. The night was clear, the stars were out and the moon was in full view, as we had fun joking, laughing and listening to music, and just being kids really. While a lot of us drank that night, I didn't drink much, because my mom would have kicked my ass if she found out I was drinking. My cousins, however, were getting more and more drunk by the hour. It was about 12:30 a.m. when I got a call from my cousin Ben, who said he wanted to come down to after hearing I was in town. He told me he'd walked toward us and meet us at the crossroads. Me, being the only sober one. I rallied everyone together for the long walk, which I hoped would sober them up a bit. As we began walking down the old dirt road, I began to feel that something wasn't quite right. It was very quiet, too quiet. The only real noise was coming from my cousin's drunk, obnoxious voices, which was pretty off as normally there are frogs and all sorts of things around at night, making all sorts of noises. Again, I tried to tell everyone something was off. But drunk, they brushed it off and laughed. We were about 40 meters away from the crossroads when I saw it, a giant creature hiding by the underbrush of the trees near the crossroads. It just stood there, staring at us, hiding from the streetlight in such a way that if you weren't paying attention, you'd have missed it. This was the first time I'd ever feel a real shiver down my spine or my hair stand on the back of my neck. It seemed as though the creature was waiting for us. I stopped dead in my tracks to stare, afraid to move. The creature stood about 7 feet tall, was bipedal, humanoid, would look like to be both legs and a long tail that stuck out. But its upper half almost looks human. It wore a long black trench coat. Least that's what it looked like. Its face was that of a boss with black fur all around and glowing eyes. I've never felt so afraid for my life. After what seemed like hours, which was likely only minutes of staring at this thing, my cousin stopped and asked me what was wrong. I didn't reply, and they began murdering and confusion until my eldest cousin Joe said, guys, look," pointing at the crossroads where I was staring. My cousins all looked and finally saw the thing. We all freaked out and my fight or flight kicked in. At which point I turned and ran as fast as I could away from the creature, didn't dare look back to see if we were being pursued. I just kept hauling it until we were all the way home. Upon finally arriving at the house, we all stared at one another, silence and afraid. I soon called my cousin Ben to let him know we decided to head back to the house instead of meeting him at the crossroads. The strangest part was he informed me he never called me to meet up and that he was in the city of Edmonton spending weekend with his girlfriend. This really tripped me out. And I checked the call log to see if he'd call it, at which point I realized this call never logged on my phone. I was thinking, what the heck? This is really weird. This is where the story ends. I live in Hungary, in a suburb about 30 to 40 kilometers from Budapest. Despite the local stories about such, I've lived here for 12 years and never really in stories of paranormal phenomena. About a year ago, I was working in a PC shop franchise store, and about 5 kilometers from where I live was one of the shops from our franchise. Normally we work from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. for about 5 or 6 days a week and then we're off, but it was early December and people are nuts that time of year with shopping. So I was working my 8th straight day of work and also overtime. Closing the store. At the end of the day, I jumped into my car and began to drive home. There's 2 roads that can get me home. One is the main road, which is constantly filled with traffic jams, and the other is a back road with nothing but woods on one side and a field on the other. This road was in very bad shape, and as such, virtually no one would use it for fear of destroying their cars or tires. At this time, I was still driving my first car, which was a really banged-up '97 Opel. So I didn't really care about damage to my car. There were no street lights on this road. And as such, my car's lights were the only lights visible at the time. You need to understand that this is a road I've traveled hundreds of times by car, on a bike, and on foot, and I've never seen anything out of the ordinary here. This night, however, I saw the coolest thing ever. There was a flock of birds rushing the road, and even though I didn't care much about my old junker, I was traveling slow on the road as I didn't feel like walking home on a December night because my car broke down from my carelessness. I've always been a city boy, but's had basic knowledge of how wildlife could hurt you if you were careless, and there's laws against killing certain animals even accidentally. Because of this, I stopped to let these birds cross. I had been listening to my headphones as I don't have a car radio, and I know this is dangerous to do while driving. But I figured I'm on a road with no one else, so it should be safe. So I was debating getting out and taking one of the birds as a pet. It was at this point that I realized they weren't birds. They were tiny owls. Realizing this, I didn't take any of the birds, as one, they are protected by wall, and two, where there are kids there are likely any parents working nearby. And the last thing that I wanted was an adult owl attacking me. Deciding to just watch the birds, and with my headphones on full blast, I suddenly believed I heard something. Taking off my headsets, I listened closely, but I heard nothing, at least at first. Just as I was about to put my headphones back on my head, I heard the most otherworldly screech I've ever heard in my life. It was high pitch, but also like a growl, if that makes any sense at all. I was scared shitless, but then I thought maybe it was a mother owl trying to scare me away, or another predator. Keep in mind, I'd never heard an owl screech, so I didn't know if this is what they did. The moment this thought crossed my mind, I somewhat relaxed, thinking that maybe I had been overthinking things. It turns out I was quite wrong. The next thing I saw, only for a split second, has been burned into my mind forever. Something flew down and snatched at least one of the owls, and then went back into the air. The creature was bipedal and grabbed the owls with hands with long claws on them. The creature was also wading, muscular, and had huge bat-like wings. It landed at one point in a crouched position. But even sitting like this, it was huge. I never saw its head, but from the side it looked as though it had short black fur. In a large flapping noise, it instantly vanished into the night. I saw some snow dust from where it vanished from, and the entire incident lasted maybe a few seconds at most, but it instantly put me into panic mode. I floored it, and my only thought was that I needed to get out of here now. About 3 huge bumps later, though, I slowed down, and again, not wanting to be stuck walking in the cold or out in the open with that thing lurking around. When I finally made it home, I attempted to logically think out what had happened. I didn't have a logical explanation. However, as I wasn't sleep deprived, I also didn't drink, and I didn't do drugs. To this day, I have no idea what that thing was. And I've never shared my story with anyone else, not even family. I no longer work where I once did. And so I have no reason to use that road again. Nor would I, especially at night. If anyone else has an idea of what this thing could have been, please let me know. It was last summer, and I was at a bonfire at a friend's house with a good friend of mine, Mike, his wife, and their 4 kids. The adults were drinking beer around the fire, and the kids were playing on the trampoline. Everyone was enjoying themselves that night. Eventually, we all gathered around the fire after playing a game of tag with the kids. Mike and I were talking around the fire when we heard what sounded like a small puppy crying. "Do you hear that?" Mike asked. I replied, "Yeah, sounds like a dog or something in the woods." "I bet it's a coyote pup," Mike said while motioning to the woods behind them. The night went down and continued drinking and talking while collecting more firewood for the fire from the woodpile. An hour goes by and we could still hear what sounds like a puppy crying. Eventually, I rose up, grabbed my cane, and got a flashlight when my guest me, "You're gonna go check it out," to which I replied, "Yeah, it's bothering me. Besides, it might be a pup and that would be kind of cool." I walked about 100 yards from the group towards the forest. Then I stopped listening to my surroundings, hoping to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It wasn't long before I started hearing it again. I walked into the woods about 20 yards. When the sound suddenly stopped, I stopped as well, listening closely. Maybe 30 seconds later, I hear the sound once again. This time it's about 20 feet in. It sounds like it might be in front of me. In this brush. I turned the flashlight on and started scanning the area, hoping to catch any reflection of the eyes. This was an extremely bright flashlight but lit the whole area around me, but I never saw any eyes. Still, I could hear the whimpering though. I knelt down and tried to beckon it with kissing sounds and a soft voice, much the way one might call their own puppy or dog. Still nothing. A few seconds later, out of nowhere, with no sound or movement in the woods, I heard the whimpering again. This time, 20 feet to the left of me. I was thrown as it's impossible for something to move that fast without making some kind of movement or noise. There were tons of leaves, so it should have crunched at least. That I shrugged this off, rationalizing maybe there was more than one puppy, before continuing my search. After a few more minutes of trying to coax the puppy out of the bush, the sounds jumped to my left again, about 15 to 30 feet away. At this point, I'm quite perplexed by the situation. "What the heck is going on?" grumbled of myself. That's when the sound jumped back to the original spot I heard it from upon beginning my search. As I'm searching confused, I suddenly hear a loud screech bellow out from the tree above me. This sound was loud, angry, and like nothing had ever heard before. Looking up, I saw this thing only for a split second before it jumped to another tree. It was a man-sized creature with arms and legs, no hair. It had very grayish, pale-colored skin. The thing was very thin and just looked natural at all. After it jumped to the next tree, I tried to give chase, but when I arrived at the next tree, there was nothing. There was no movement in the trees anymore, and I tried to listen for any sound, that still nothing. Mike and a French student showed up after having heard me shout earlier. They asked if I was okay, and I attempted to explain to them what I had seen. While explaining this, I saw movement in the trees, and I immediately checked it out, and the tree was a black mist that soon turned deeper into the forest. Shortly after this, one of the women screamed, asking if we had seen something. I asked her what she seen, as she explained there was a black smoke that shot off unnaturally into the woods. I can't say for sure, as I never found it or witnessed it again. But I believe what I saw that night could have been one to go. I believe it was mimicking the sounds of a puppy to luring one or more of the children to the woods. I live in a neighborhood surrounded by thick, dark forest in East Michigan. We often get all kinds of wildlife out here. But something is very off about the woods themselves. The woods are very dark, even for woods, and always get this feeling of eeriness when I go near them. It's like I'm being watched by something. One night, something quite strange happened that I'll remember forever. I was out in the yard, and it was getting dark, which I didn't really think much of, as I love sitting out at night watching the stars. That's when I was overcome with an overwhelming fear of being watched. Looking towards the woods, I see what looks like a 7-foot-tall, unnaturally skinny person. A feeling of curiosity overwhelmed me, and I walked towards the creature at first. That's when the figure turned towards me. But it changed. I was now looking at a buck with huge antlers. I thought it was going crazy and stood there, lost and confused as to do what into the woods. The thing never took his eyes off me as it did this. A few months go by, and I basically forgot about the incident, and so one late winter nights when I awoke about midnight feeling an intense panic. Looking towards my window, I saw it, a 7-foot-tall, thin figure. From what little I could see, it seemed like an emaciated human with the face and muzzle of a deer. It had long, unnatural arms ended and clawed hands. What was I even looking at? The thing eventually slowly moved away from the window, at which point my fear subsided. The next morning, I checked for tracks in the snow. But there were only deer tracks. Nothing I could really claim as out of the ordinary. Was maybe 3 or 4 when this happened. I grew up in Shallow-Water, Kansas. It's a quiet town with not many people living there back then and far less living there now. I was in my grandmother's front yard, playing the dirt. When on top of a school, across the way, I see something hunched over and at the corner of my eye. It was too small to be a man or a woman. And I seriously doubted a child would be up on the roof. I looked at it for a couple of minutes and noticed it was tall, black and looked to be eating a small animal of some kind, had red eyes, and I could see this thing playing his day. You know how gray aliens supposedly look. Its eyes were large like that, but red. I also remember the thing had a large mouth. Eventually, the thing noticed me, stood up and jumped off the school and slowly walked towards me, never losing eye contact as I did this. After about the 4th step, I ran inside screaming and crying. Unfortunately, that's all I really remember. Apparently, according to my dad, I was screaming and begging him and my grandpa not to go outside because of the black creature. My grandpa loaded his Remington 870 with slugs and headed outside anyway. He eventually found tracks heading north about 15 feet before they simply disappeared. The tracks had 3 long toes with short and sharp nails. I've only been back to that town once since I moved. It was a few months ago, and I still get the same feeling as it as a child. It feels like something is there watching me from a place I can't see. One final thing, my father told me he was talking to my grandma a few weeks before the initial incident when they had medium-sized footsteps on top of the house that eventually landed on the AC unit outside of the home, damaging, yet he claims whatever it was couldn't be human. It's puts us with too loud, too heavy, and moved too fast. He stayed up the entire night, shotgun loaded, but found nothing. I never found out what the thing was either and refused to go back to that town unarmed ever again. I was 15 years old when I went to my grandparents' house in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. There was nothing but desert for miles, and I'd heard from an old desert rat that we'll call Jay about Indian folklore and when to ghosts. I was amazed by his story of an encounter with one and the folklore in general. Still up into the point of the story. I still didn't really believe in such things. Only one night though. It was pitch black and I was outside the back of the house looking at the stars. If it wasn't long before I heard something shuffling around the garage, I looked back and saw my granddad. But I couldn't shake this really bad feeling. He told me to come find him. But something in his voice wasn't right. Saying nothing. I headed and asked my grandma why my granddad was in the garage with no lights, at which point she gave me a weird look. Before going back to washing the dishes, I soon went into my living room, and much to my horror, that was my grandfather, laying on the couch sleeping. I went to bed soon after him, was awoken at about 1 in the morning to the sound of footsteps and this awful decaying smell outside my window. It was open because there was no AC in the house. The fact that the only thing separating me from whatever was outside was a thin screen and the window really was not comforting. I tried to chalk it up to my imagination going wild, and maybe being an animal or something. But then I heard more footsteps, and I could tell whatever it was standing on 2 legs. I thought, okay, maybe a bird within a herd. More footsteps. The strides that was taking were too heavy and too long to be a bird. Whatever was out there suddenly started running back and forth in front of the house, before finally stopping outside my window. Hearing this made my heart sink, and I was overwhelmed by the smell of rotting decay. I finally gathered the strength to look up, and that was a huge mistake. I realize now that I was staring directly at this thing. It was tall, skinny, had patches of dark fur and the head of a deer, the antlers that have looked like that of a deer on one side and the elk on another side. It's tried speaking to me and telling me to go outside. But its voice sounded as though we couldn't put any real emotion to its words. I screamed and without thinking grabbed my hunting rifle before blasting through my window. My grandparents naturally came rushing in. And we heard a yell out back. In the 10 seconds it took us to get out back, we all saw him, this thin, unnaturally long leg thing. And then it was gone. Nothing. And I mean nothing can move that fast. This incident onsets to this day, and we never go outside after dark, nor will we ever again. I live in the UK. And we don't have many dangerous animals here. My dad works on a farm where they have a big problem with foxes and rabbits, which we hunt, by the way. The most effective way of hunting these animals at night is through thermal and night vision. One night when I was about 12, we were about shooting. This was about midnight by this point. We were on the way back home. We scanned the fuel and saw nothing until we reached a point roughly 50 yards from us. I could see a dark shave, and assuming it was a fox, I got ready to shoot. It was then when it stood up I realized it wasn't a fox. The creature had a long tail that curled up at the end, a short face, and stood about 4 feet tall. I was pretty sure it was a cat, and a big one at that. But we don't have these in the UK. This was confirmed when the animal turned its head and stared straight at me. It was a big cat. It started crouching and slowly made its way towards us. I had watched a few documentaries, so I knew that the animal was now stalking us. I was frozen solid and the hair stood on the back of my head. I don't usually get scared. But I was terrified as it was around 20 yards away now, and it lunged towards us. I snapped it in my daze and then moved the shotgun down before firing. I heard a screech almost human-like that was very loud. I knew I hit it, but it ran off. My dad switched up on the head torch he had and we moved closer. I can see quite a bit of blood on the ground. We didn't find it that night, but I know that it's probably dead. And before someone says I'm cruel or evil, it was me, or my dad, or that animal. So yeah, that's my story. We never saw anything like that again. But still, I continue to go shooting at nights multiple times a month. It all started with a camping trip that I had been planning with some friends of mine. We all live in the Central Florida area, and we planned on going north a bit to camp and a free site that we found. Unfortunately, one thing led to another, and I was the only one able to get the time off as it was in December, and becoming more and more difficult to get vacation time. I didn't let this stop me as I wanted to go camping for years now. And this was the best shot that I had. The plan was to only stay for 2 nights. I would head to the site, set up camp. My friends would join me for the first day, and I will be alone for the rest. When I got to the parking lot, I talked to an older man named Stanley, who was a retired park ranger who had looked after the campsite. He gave me directions to my site and went over a few rules like no one that ended fires, no loud noises after 10 p.m., and to leave the spa as clean as you found it. After I got my tent and table set up, I decided to visit the 2 neighboring campsites. It was about a 10-minute walk to the next site either way. So what helped me waste some time before my friends got off work and joined me? My neighbors to the west of me were an elderly couple that were packing up just as I arrived. The neighbor to the east of me was a man in his maybe mid-40s. His name was Pete. Pete was an odd-looking fellow who was dressed in an open shirt-sleeves Hawaiian shirt with no undershirt and a massive beer guy hanging out, tattered cargo shorts and flip-flops. This year, our winter was pretty warm. So this didn't really surprise me. After introducing myself, we shared some beers and talked for a few hours. I asked him, "So what brings you to the woods this time of year?" And he replied squatchin' loud for a bit and noticed he was serious. He said that Sasquatch or skunk ape as they're caught in Florida live in the area, and he has a few cameras set up here in the heavily wooded areas behind both of our campsite. After talking for a bit more, my friends texted me, and so I thanked Pete for the beers and told him good luck to his hunt. After my friends I left for the night, I decided to pack it up at around 10:30 p.m. I snuffed out my fire and near my tent to begin to drift off to sleep in a somewhat strange way. The forest almost becomes louder at night as the sound of crickets and owls fill the night. I found it very relaxing and it helped me fall asleep. I was soon awoken in the middle of the night and it was strangely silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the occasional nightingale, just silence. Then I hear it. It started as a low howl and ended up as a sharp whoop. Now, I have heard coyotes before, and their howl is much too high pitched for this to be some sort of coyote. My heart started racing. I had never heard anything like this before. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard a loud crack, because it sounded like someone took a branch and cracked it over a tree, followed by several loud cracks following it. I heard of Sasquatch using wood knocking to communicate, and this is definitely what it sounded like to me. Has anyone from the North Florida or South Alabama, Georgia area ever heard a similar sound? It sounds like it's concave to me. And I bet they definitely live in this area. My story is kind of short, but a really strange one. When I was maybe 8 or 9, I had never experienced anything strange or unexplainable. I never believed in ghosts or ghouls or anything like that. But one night, all that had been thrown out the window. One night after me and my mom had gotten back after a long shopping spree. When we got home, I helped unpack the groceries and then joined my mom for a movie. At around 8:30, my mom told me it was time to hit the hay. And so I did. I sprawled out on my bed. My mom came and talked to me in, and before I knew it, I was asleep. Now this is where things get a tad strange. I have woken up at around 12:30 in the morning. I opened my eyes and examined my room until something came in contact with the trees outside my window. For a while, I just stared at them until I noticed movement. I just stared at what looked like a hairless demon squirrel of some sort slowly and unnaturally crawling down from the top of a tree. I rubbed my eyes, not believing what I was seeing. But when I opened my eyes, what I saw was horrifying. I will now try my best to describe it. It looked like a hairless squirrel with an abnormally large head compared to its body. Its limbs were lanky and distorted with legs that went back, just like a bird's, if it was skinny to the point where you could see bones, and it was pretty pale and gray. I started hyperventilating as this thing was looking through all of the windows in my apartment complex, while positioning itself on a branch. Then its eyes met mine, but they didn't look like eyes. They looked like empty sockets where the eye should be. It didn't seem to have a mouth and 2 slits for nose. I hid under my covers for about 5 seconds, then looked back and it was gone. I ran to my mom crying and stuttering my work before telling her everything that had happened. But she didn't believe me and chalked it up to just being a bad dream. But I know what I saw. I am now much older, and I've told my friends about it. And they all somehow believe me. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just a dream. Or maybe it actually was real. Or maybe it's just some kind of misconception or something. I don't know, but I don't want to ever see it again.